Welcome back to the news desk. We've brought in a couple of experts here to walk us through the metagame analysis of Team Unified Standard. This has been an interesting puzzle. We got Frank Karsten, Randy Buehler, a pair of Hall of Famers here to talk to us about it. Frank, what do we need to know about Team Unified Standard and this format that was being played here today down the stretch at the World Magic Cup?
Yeah, so Team Unified Standard, we also saw it yesterday as a format, but the gist is that it has some specific deck construction rules. In Team Unified Standard, every team must construct 3 standard legal decks, and among all 3 decks and sideboards combined, there can be no more than 4 copies of any standard legal card, well, except for basic lands. So basically you have one trade folder with a playset of standard, and your entire team has to build 3 decks from that, which means that you can't just show up with 3 Abzan decks or something like that. You have to split up the cards somehow.
Right, if you put all the decks on top of each other, it would still be a standard legal deck.
Exactly.
So what are the challenges of building a deck under those constraints?
Well, the big challenge is dealing with overlap. If we go to the most important cards for Unified Standards, in at least the current standards, they are the fetch lands, because so many of the decks in Standard rely on basically 12 fetch lands, especially in combination with the battle lands. They allow you to play powerful gold cards in your deck. They fuel Delve, allow for consistent mana. So many of typical Standard decks play as many as 12 fetch lands. Well, that doesn't add up for Team Unified. Right. There are only 5 fetch lands in the format. You only have access to 20 total. So yeah, that leads to a challenge, how to split it up.
So what do you do? I mean, I know we'll hear people talking about these decks often as, a Wooded Foothills deck or a Flooded Strand deck or...
Well, it means that either basically you have to find some deck in the format that doesn't really play fetch lands, or you have to go for a different adjusted mana base. So transforming a deck that would typically be maybe a Windswept Heath deck, maybe some Abzan deck, into a deck that relies more on different lands, like Tri lands, Pain lands, those kinds of things.
Okay, so what did people do? What did this format end up looking like on day one?
Sure. So this is the big table that I prepared. Here are the fetch lands, but here you see all the different deck configurations that were played by all the teams who made it to day 2 with at least 8 points in the standard rounds yesterday.
So this is the way teams that won solved the puzzle.
Yeah, essentially. So at least 2 wins, 2 draws or better. Those I took, and then I tried to structure them somehow. And as it turned out, every team had 1 deck with Wooded Foothills, 1 deck with Flooded Strand and/or Jace, and 1 third deck, which is where the real craziness of the format arises. But maybe we'll just go over the columns one by one. Right, in the first column, you saw the Wooded Foothills deck, and this was a bit of a dividing point for many teams, because both Atarka Red needs this land in order to fix the mana, fuel Delve for Become Immense, but also Abzan aggro to get both Canopy Vista and Smoldering Marsh, or even a basic forest to play a turn 1 Warden of the first 3. So most teams said, we have to choose between the 2. And Atarka Red was the more popular option of the 2.
More popular though, but it's kind of only 9 out of 14. It felt to me, watching the format yesterday, like everyone had an Atarka Red deck. And here it looks like of the winning teams, the sort of 3-1-ish or better teams, it's actually only about 2/3 of them.
Yeah, it's true. I would have expected a little more Atarka Red as well, mainly because the deck doesn't really take many other cards away from other decks,
right,
as Abzan aggro typically does. But I guess many people still want to play their Siege Rhinos. Perhaps there were some Abzan experts in the teams who wanted to play a deck that they were comfortable with. Or
it could also be, though, that everyone knowing that Atarka Red was going to be such a defining part of the metagame meant that the winning teams didn't necessarily have them. You had, 5 of those 14 winning teams just didn't have Atarka Red and maybe caught their opponents by surprise a little bit.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. Yesterday we went into an overview of the format where we arrived at Atarka Red plus Eldrazi Ramp and Esper Dragons as the obvious configuration to beat because there would be no overlap between them. But yeah, every other team knew that as well. So that allowed for some next leveling and perhaps this basic, obvious setup turned out to be kind of a self-denying prophecy.
Then again, still 9 Atarka Reds. It's still a pretty big piece of the puzzle.
So for the second deck, in the second column, this deck with typically Flutterstrand and Jace together, the more popular options were, well, Esper Dragons and 4-color Rally. Both just good decks in Standard with solid matchups across the board. And very importantly, no overlap with Atarka Red. They need a completely different set of fetch lands.
One Dark Jeskai deck snuck in there.
Yeah, and a regular tricolor Jeskai deck. Some Esper tokens decks as well. These turned out to be variants typically with Jace, which actually needs a similar set of cards as Esper Dragons. So a different strategy, but as far as Unified Standard is concerned, it needs the same. Yeah, exactly.
What does the Esper tokens deck look like? Like what is it doing to generate tokens?
Typically cards like Secure the Waste, maybe some versions might have Hangback Walker, Gideon, Sorin, those kinds of cards, and then boost them with Gideon, Sorin, and it works together.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting though because so many of the Esper Dragons decks weren't necessarily a great home for Gideon. Right, you tend not to have that much white mana in an Esper Dragons deck, but if you go to Esper tokens to a little more white base, you actually get to take advantage of, this powerful Planeswalker card that otherwise might not have a home.
Yep. 4-color Rally, I should also mention that many teams told me that they chose this deck because they felt it had a good matchup against both Atarka Red and Eldrazi Ramp. Both decks that were very much expected in the metagame. So that was also some of the thinking that went into deck choice for this event. Now if we go to the third deck.
That's where things get really interesting.
Oh yeah.
This was supposed to be the Windswept Heath column, but you couldn't quite zero in just on Windswept Heaths here?
No, well for several reasons. First off, Windswept Heath was sometimes taken by Atarka Red or by the 4-color Rally deck. So this third deck was quite often a deck that didn't have any fetch lands at all. Often with Hangback Walker as well. But quite often a deck that tried to go for kind of a different mana base as what you would typically see in Standard. So it was nice to see all these different options. The restrictions on Unified Standard bred some creativity. Now, 6 of the teams went for an Eldrazi Ram deck still, which was kind of the obvious choice because it doesn't need any fetch lands. But the players who relied on Ulamog did go into a bit of a hostile field because, well, first of all, everyone was ready for it with their infinite obliteration.
Yeah, I was surprised that there were still 6 in there because it seemed like everyone came to your baseline conclusion of, Atarka Red, Eldrazi Ramp, but then everyone's like, I don't want to play Eldrazi in this field full of Atarka Red.
Yeah, that's
and in a field where everyone knows Eldrazi is a big thing to prepare for, yet it still worked for almost half of the winning teams.
Like, it is still a fair deck to play, and very importantly, it doesn't take any cards away from the other decks. So
still powerful, still has no overlap with your other decks.
So it was a deck that was played still a bit, but still the majority of teams try to avoid it, and for good reasons, as you also explained. Some of the ways to avoid it were actually depending on which deck you had in the second column. If you were playing 4-color Rally there, then you had already taken up, say, all the fetch lands between Atarka Red and 4-color Rally, but you might still have Shambling Vent and Case of Coilers remaining, which meant that you could play, say, some white-black deck, which doesn't need fetch lands, but fixes the mana with Shambling Vent, Case of Coilers, and so on. So often a token variant as well.
Interesting.
But if you would go for, say, Esper Dragons with Atarka Red, then, well, the Shambling Vent was often already taken up, but you might still have, say, Windswept Heath remaining. So then you could play, that's at least what one team did, some Ebs and Aggro deck, which has a bit of a crippled mana base, but with some creative building, you can make it mitigated.
I was going to ask, what does the Abzan aggro deck in column 1 look like versus the Abzan aggro deck? If we did a Venn diagram of those decks, what's on the outside of that overlap?
Well, the key difference is Wooded Foothills.
Yeah.
The ones on the left side of the table have a better mana base because they still have access to Wooded Foothills. The one on the right side have fewer fetch lands and rely more on pain lands to fix their mana. Other options you would see in the third deck column are Mardu or black-red decks, especially if players had Abzan aggro instead of Atarka red, then they might have Bloodstained Mire still left over. And what can you do with that? Well, Mardu and black-red decks are key options
Those are like
there.
Crackling Doom decks.
Yeah, often with some Thunderbreak regions and Dragon synergies as well. And it's also interesting to see that in the third column, all the non-Eldrazi decks were all black decks. Perhaps because they get access to Duress, which is still a good card against both the Atarka Red and Eldrazi Ramp, right? Some metagaming going on as well in the deck choice.
You talked about Infinite Obliteration as a card you want to bring in against these Eldrazi decks. Is that also part of the reason maybe you're a black deck in that slot?
I'm sure it was a consideration for several of the teams heading into this peculiar format. Yeah.
If you were going to pick one of the decks out of that third slot, what's the one that really leapt out to you as being something exciting to play?
I liked the white-black tokens decks. This is an archetype that has been around for a while in Standard already, but often with more of a fetchland mana base. It was good to see that the players here showed how to build it without needing these fetchlands and still retain a very competitive, solid strategy.
Okay, well there you have it. That's a look at Team Unified Standard here at the World Magic Con.